But we are going to kick things off today with Karl Gesch. He's with the Iowa Soybean Association, and he's going to talk about some watershed planning activities that he's been involved with in partnership with a couple of local watershed efforts. So Karl, will give you a chance to go ahead.
I'll get out of your way.
And I do have a clicker here. I actually just bought this clicker, so if you want to go ahead, I'll kind of get it set up for you.
All right, I'll get started here. Thanks for the introduction, Mary Beth, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all about some of the recent watershed planning that the Iowa Soybean Association has been doing in the Cedar River Watershed. We recently completed 3 watershed plans in the Middle Cedar, but I'll also talk a little bit today about the Rock Creek Watershed, which is in the Upper Cedar. Before I dive in, I want to talk about the scale that we're watershed planning at. So there's different size watersheds, just to get everyone on the same page. A Huck 8 watershed is more of a basin scale. Thanks, Mary Beth. So that would be like the Middle Cedar or the Upper Cedar. And then as we add digits to the Huck, which is the hydrologic unit code, it's kind of like an address for a watershed, we get to more specific of a location. So if there's 12 digits, that's a Huck 12 watershed, and it's a smaller area, more specific address within Iowa, or a bigger watershed, if you will. So the Upper Cedar watershed has a watershed management authority, and they have a watershed plan for their Huck 8. The Middle Cedar is kind of on the cusp of forming a watershed management authority, and will develop a Huck 8 watershed plan. But these Huck 12 watershed plans are a lot more specific in terms of individual conservation practices and where they can fit on the landscape to achieve the goals of an individual small watershed. So why do we develop watershed plans for Huck 12 watersheds? There could be some sort of a water quality impairment that could be on the 303D list, which is a list that the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Agency maintain to track known impairments in water bodies. Even if there isn't an impairment in the water quality, local values or local initiatives can lead to the desire for watershed planning. And regional goals and initiatives, such as something like the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, can also motivate watershed planning, because we can have these broader goals that a specific smaller Huck 12 watershed will work towards. And there's lots of benefits to watershed planning. It's a good way to plan what's needed, identify the resources that will be necessary to accomplish the goals, and watershed planning also allows us to kind of lay out a phased schedule that allows for adaptation and adjustments on the fly as watershed projects are implemented, to ensure that progress is being made towards the goals of the watershed. So the watershed planning framework is kind of this conceptual approach to how we develop watershed plans. And the first piece of that is to choose which watersheds we're planning in. So that can be done a number of ways. In the Upper Cedar, they have, in their Huck 8 watershed plan, they've highlighted a number of high priority Huck 12 watersheds. We can also prioritize based on local desire for a watershed project. Something like the WQI projects, where local soil and water conservation districts and groups have submitted proposals to Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship based on their desire to bring additional resources for conservation into their watershed, can also be another way to prioritize watersheds. So then once we've selected watersheds, a lot of watershed planning is kind of an information gathering exercise, with the idea that all the information that we assemble through assessment and modeling and mapping, that information allows watershed stakeholders and managers to make better informed decisions. So one key element of watershed planning, which I really want to emphasize today, is stakeholder involvement, and especially local stakeholder involvement. It's one thing for a group from the outside to say, here's your watershed plan for your watershed, now do it. It's another thing for people who live and farm in the watershed to be involved throughout the watershed planning process and give input for what those goals are, what the best way to meet those goals might be. So once the goals are developed, we try to identify approaches for meeting the goals and identify the resources that are necessary. And then these last few steps here are kind of more in the implementation phase. So once you have the resources, you can start getting conservation practices on the ground. But then evaluation and monitoring kind of come back to this watershed characterization. This is an information-driven process. So what we learn during the implementation phase of a watershed program can re-inform the goal development and how we're trying to meet those goals. So it's kind of an iterative process where we refine our approach on the way. So kind of high-level conceptual approach, but as an example of this watershed planning process, I'm going to use the Miller Creek Watershed, which is in south central Black Hawk County. And Miller Creek is a WQI, Water Quality Initiative watershed, with funds from the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And they've also recently begun a project through the USDA Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which I think we're going to hear a little bit more about later. As a part of that Middle Cedar Partnership Project, one of the goals was to develop watershed plans, which I should mention. The watershed planning was funded by the Sand County Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation has also funded some of our other recent watershed planning work. So in characterizing the Miller Creek watershed, we've used high-resolution land use data from the Iowa DNR. And this land use shows that this is a highly working landscape in Miller Creek watershed. It's around 80% row crop production agriculture. So there's a lot of economic benefits from this highly rural watershed. So that's something we want to keep in mind as we're working with the local watershed residents and developing goals. Another important part of watershed planning is to account for conservation that's already been implemented on the landscape. Lots of runoff control practices like terraces and grass waterways, lots of stream buffers in the Miller Creek watershed, but still a little bit of room for improvement. Cover crops and reduced tillage practices are really difficult to track. We're still, as a conservation community, working on the best ways to track those things. You can do it with a windshield survey, which I know Shannon has recently completed for the Miller Creek watershed and the Fenton Mo Watershed. But that's labor intensive. There's some research out there to use remote sensing, but we want to account for those things as much as possible because those are good things that we collectively are doing, so we want to make sure that that's being recognized. Bioreactors and saturated buffers are edge of field control practices that don't really have an on-farm benefit, but they remove nitrates specifically from water before it leaves farms and enters streams. So there's already been a few of those implemented in the Miller Creek watershed. There's a few acres of prairie strips and ponds and perennial cover through various CRP programs. This is what it looks like on a map. If you've heard me talk before, I kind of excuse myself and say that it looks like someone kind of threw up on this map. That's a good thing though, because that means there's a lot of conservation on the ground. So it's a great kind of jumping off point to dive into the full watershed project. Water quality is also really important. Most watershed projects, water quality is a key component of the goals and the planning. So what we like to do is we monitor, or we advise monitoring stream networks throughout the watershed, so we can identify areas where conservation may be needed more heavily than other areas of the watershed. As an example, in the Miller Creek watershed, this little MC02 subwatershed, you'll notice had nitrates in 2014 and 2015 of less than 2 parts per million. To put that into context, 10 is the EPA drinking water standard. So like the Cedar Rapids Water Utility, they're interested in that level. And the reason MC02, that watershed, is so low is that it drains into a natural wetland, and that wetland is filtering out a lot of the nitrates before that water is measured just at the wetland outlet. So when we're thinking about where conservation practices should be implemented within the entire Miller Creek watershed for maximum water quality benefit at the outlet, which is this MC01 point right before Miller Creek enters the Cedar River, we want to think about water quality within the Huck 12 watershed, not just as a whole. So through the watershed planning process, which included meetings with a local group of advisory farmers and NRCS and soil water conservation districts, we identified 4 goals for the Miller Creek watershed. And the first 2 were to reduce nitrogen by 41% and phosphorus by 29%. And these numbers come from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, which calls for a 45% reduction in total nitrogen and phosphorus in Iowa lakes and streams. But the 41% and the 29% are the non-point source pollutant goals of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. Non-point source being farm fields, urban stormwater runoff, things like that. This watershed there's no non-point source pollutants or pollutant sources in it, so we went with 41 and 29% for the watershed goals. Remember that first land use map that I showed, showing that this is a heavily productive and agricultural working landscape. We want to maintain and increase the agricultural productivity within the watershed, and also reduce flood risk, both within Miller Creek and also downstream. We want to think about being good neighbors with folks in Cedar Rapids and further downstream. So thinking of not just the Miller Creek Huck-12 watershed, but maybe that whole Cedar River Basin. So after the goals have been identified, we want to identify approaches for meeting those goals, if you think back to the watershed planning framework. And this is the menu of practices, if you will, and it's not important that you read all these numbers and statistics and specific details, but this information is taken from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy Science Assessment. So this is based on data and scientific information. So we have a good idea of what practices will, what their benefits will be in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus reductions in water. One thing I will mention is that, to stick with the menu metaphor, you'd rarely walk into a restaurant and order everything off the menu. That's just not feasible. You can't eat it all, right? So an individual farm or landowner cannot feasibly implement all of these things on one parcel of land or in one operations. But if we think about a watershed as a whole, we can pick and choose these practices and put them in the best locations on the landscape to achieve the community goals. So we prioritize those practices through cultural or social preferences and factors, and also the scientific information. So the science column is kind of the impact, which we score based on the Nutrient Reduction Strategy Science Assessment. And then the social component is kind of a perceived effort. So we try to do an impact versus effort matrix, if you will, and identify the conservation practices that will have maximum benefit with as little effort as possible to get the most water quality returns for our conservation dollar and effort invested. So when we think about actually targeting these practices to the landscape, we can think about building a foundation of healthy, strong soils, which help filter water. They help sustain agricultural productivity through increased organic matter and nutrient cycling. So things like cover cropping, reducing or eliminating tillage, and managing our nutrient application and sources are great things to promote on all cropland in agricultural watersheds. And then as we think about reducing the nutrients further in water before it enters the streams, edge of field practices like bioreactors and saturated buffers, and wetlands, and then perennial cover like prairie strips or CRP can be targeted to much more specific locations on the landscape to achieve those water quality goals. So to kind of illustrate this, we like to use this approach, which is based on the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, which is a philosophy and a set of mapping tools developed by some scientists from the National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment. And this is a really good way to illustrate. We can kind of think about moving up this pyramid, building a foundation of healthy, strong, well-functioning soils, and then begin targeting conservation practices as we kind of move up this conceptual diagram. So to illustrate this targeting, I'm going to use Lime Creek, which is the first watershed plan that ISA has developed with the use of these Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework mapping tools. So we start with a watershed with not accounting for existing conservation practices. We start with a watershed, and then we promote soil health on all croplands. So things like cover crops, reducing tillage, managing our nutrients. And then, now that we have the foundation of the pyramid, I'm actually going to go back up to the top of the pyramid because those locations have to be much more specific, and then we'll kind of work our way back down to that foundation. So next, wetlands. These small blue dots can be targeted to specific locations in the landscape based on land use and topographic information. And then we next target edge of field practices. Those are saturated buffers and bioreactors. We've identified fields within the Lime Creek watershed, which is in Buchanan County, I should mention, that are suitable or potentially suitable for these types of practices. And then next, we've identified depressions and floodplains as good opportunities for perennial cover, such as in the CRP program, which has water quality and soil health benefits, and also potentially some profitability benefits for farmers. If we think about low returning areas and fields that may be frequently wet and difficult to farm. And then the last thing is to kind of fill in the gaps with cover crops. So areas that may not be treated by a nitrate removal wetland or may not be treated with a bioreactor or a saturated buffer. Cover crops are good for building soil health, but also do a great job at sequestering nitrates from tile water. So this is the conceptual plan for Lime Creek, kind of stepping through that conservation pyramid. Going back to Miller Creek, this is what the conceptual plan looks like. So remember I mentioned earlier in the presentation how this sub-watershed up here that's treated by the natural wetland has pretty good water quality already. So in this watershed plan, we haven't targeted any conservation practices there. That being said, it's still important for those farmers when they're thinking about their profitability and long-term productivity to think about things that build soil health, like reducing tillage and implementing cover crops. So in developing these watershed plans, we also like to lay out a phased implementation approach, because it's one thing to look at that map and say, that's impossible, how can we do all that? That's way too difficult to achieve. So we like to lay out kind of a gradual timeline so watershed stakeholders can kind of gauge progress throughout the watershed project. It's a 15-year horizon for the Miller Creek watershed, with goals of nearly 20,000 acres of cover crops, so just under half of the watershed, and a good deal of perennial cover and nutrient management and nitrification inhibitor, things like that. And then edge of field practices, 40 of them, which is quite a few for a small watershed, but based on some modeling we do, that's what's needed to get to those goals, along with the nitrate removal wetlands. But these numbers look overwhelming, but when we think about the next 5-year horizon, it's only 2016 right now. Miller Creek is already well on its way to implementing the practices in this first 5-year column. So it's a lot more digestible with this kind of phased approach. We like to model the improvements, so we use 2010 as the baseline for the modeling, because that's when the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy was developed. And based on that existing conservation practice map, nitrogen and phosphorus loads, we estimate that they've been reduced by 4% since 2010. That's a pretty small reduction, so it's probably difficult to see that in just a 5-year time span, but within the next 10 to 15 years on a little bit longer horizon, the idea is that there's annual variability, but the trend is still headed in the right direction. And then using that phased implementation timeline, our modeling suggests that the nitrogen load will be reduced by 41%, which is the non-point source goal from the nutrient reduction strategy, phosphorus by 31%, which overachieves on the 29% goal from the nutrient reduction strategy for non-point sources.
So can you explain,
Yeah.
2010 was the baseline, 2015 was the conditions.
So
between 2010 and 2015, in that 5-year time frame, whatever practices were installed during that time frame have been shown to reduce by that much?
Yeah, that's our estimate. Yep. Did everyone hear what Jeff asked? So Jeff asked how we modeled the 2015 conditions based on the 2010 baseline. That was using conservation that was implemented in that 5-year time span.
Pretty minimal, yeah.
Small changes?
Yeah, so 2010 to 2015 for a lot of this nutrient reduction strategy got ramped up, yeah. So there wouldn't be a whole lot to show within that time frame to correspond to those smaller numbers.
Right, right. That's why it's 4%, you're saying? Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
In actuality, the time frame the grant, this is the third year of a 3-year grant, so really, 2010 is not really, you're back to the baseline, 2012, when we were able to pick up on that grant. So in 3 years, we've seen this, and you have to keep in mind that this is outreach to kick this off, move this ahead in that regard. So the first year, we're really moving ahead, and after that, it's accelerating. So it's more exponential moving in that direction rather than the drag line that you see there.
Thanks, sir. That answer your question, Jim? Another important thing is to estimate the cost, right? These conservation practices and watershed projects aren't free. So we've estimated the cost for implementing cover crops and paying for CRP, installing bioreactors, saturated buffers, wetlands, things like that, with an annual operating cost of nearly $600,000, and that's based on cost share rates for cover crops and reducing tillage through the Water Quality Initiative project in Miller Creek, and then installation costs for these edge of field and in-stream structural practices that further reduce nutrients in the water. And those equate to nearly $5 million for Miller Creek Watershed. So pretty small watershed, it's around 45,000 acres, or 42,000 acres, excuse me. And it's a high price tag, but with this sort of plan in place, the stakeholders can go to funding agencies and say, we know what it's going to take, help us get there. And then, of course, as the project is being implemented, monitoring and evaluation are really essential components of the watershed plan, or of the watershed project. So the watershed plan also contains recommendations and strategies for both water quality monitoring and also kind of some social indicator tracking as well. But Miller Creek is just one watershed, so it's one watershed, 2 Huck 12 watersheds within this broader Cedar River Basin. And Iowa Soybean Association has also worked on 3 other watershed plans in the Cedar River watershed. The Fenton Mo Watershed is part of the Fenton Mo Nutrient Reduction Demonstration Project, which is also part of the Cedar Rapids Regional Conservation Partnership Program project, which we'll hear more about. And then Lime Creek, just across the Cedar River in southwest Buchanan County, and Rock Creek Watershed up in Mitchell County, which the watershed plan for that was completed in 2014. So that was the first watershed plan in the Cedar River that we've been involved with that has been completed at the Huck 12 scale. So I want to briefly go through each of these 4, kind of some similar stats to the Miller Creek. The number of structural and edge of field practices, so that's bioreactors, saturated buffers, and nitrate removal wetlands. In the about 45,000 acre Rock Creek watershed is 32, with over 31,000 acres of cover crops, and a similar one-time cost budget to Miller Creek, similar size watershed, but slightly higher annual costs. And that's based on one of the goals of that watershed advisory committee was to implement cover crops on all cropland. So that's why their cover crop acreage is higher, which makes their annual operating cost higher.
Is that a local driven goal?
Yep, so the farmers in the Rock Creek watershed, along with the Mitchell Soil and Water Conservation District, applied for a watershed planning grant from, I believe it was IDOLS, and we had watershed planning funds from Walton Foundation, and that was a very farmer-driven watershed planning process. The Miller Creek watershed, we've just seen those, but similar operating costs other than the cover crop annual operating budget, and similar watershed area. The Fenton Mo Watershed project area is actually 3 Huck 12 watersheds with 3 separate streams. This is Wolf Creek, which the headwaters of Wolf Creek are further to the southwest, and then Rock Creek and Pratt Creek. So a little bit more of a unique situation where it's not just one water body, but it's a project area, and we were developing the plan for it, and the modeling still worked out just fine with the separate water bodies. Because it's much larger, it needs a lot higher amount of these structural and edge of field practices. So the costs are a lot higher, but it kind of averages out to similar values. And same with Lime Creek Watershed in Buchanan County, which is smaller than the other 3 watershed plans, or the other 3 watersheds. But the cover crop and structural field practice density, if you will, per area of the watershed is right in line with the others. So this next slide I'm going to show kind of expands these calculations to the entire Cedar River Basin and this is some very back of the envelope calculation, but I think it just kind of gets us thinking about the magnitude of what is necessary to implement successful watershed projects. So we're talking about 5 million acres for the Cedar River Basin, and if we average out from these other 4 watershed plans and scale up, that's nearly 5,000 structural practices, wetlands, bioreactors, and saturated buffers. Probably a little high because there's some larger urban areas in the Cedar River watershed, but we're just doing back of the envelope math here, right? Over half of that area in cover crops with a one-time cost budget of about $550 million and an annual operating cost for cover crops and reducing tillage cost share of over $100 million. That's a lot of money, right? I'd like to think that in the long run, these annual costs will be more distributed, not just cost share. It'll just be a combination of support through cost share programs, but also farmers will start to realize the long-term economic value of implementing those types of practices. And these one-time costs, if you scale up to the state of Iowa, are about $4 billion on a per area basis, which is right in line with estimates for implementing the nutrient reduction strategy for the entire state. So kind of back of the envelope numbers, take these with a grain of salt. It's not a plan for the Cedar River Basin by any means, but just kind of gives some perspective on what we're talking in terms of cost. So in implementing these watershed plans, it's one thing to have a plan in place, but it's a whole other challenge to implement the plan. And collaboration is a really key component of taking that plan and turning it into conservation on the landscape. So these 4 plans have all been developed since the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy was released, which is kind of the guiding document or the guiding principles behind these watershed plans, which is a common goal for not just these watersheds in the Cedar River Basin, but the entire state of Iowa. Partnerships through things like the RCPP, like the Middle Cedar Partnership Project and the newly awarded Cedar Rapids, Charles City Project, blanking, thank you, are great ways to take these plans. The Charles City Project includes 5 Puck 12 watersheds, 2 of which are the Rock Creek Watershed. So once these watershed plans are in place or have been completed, and then these partnerships are formed, it's a lot more efficient to pool the funding and pool resources to get the conservation implemented. And the new Housing and Urban Development grant of $97 million, which was awarded to the state of Iowa, that's a lot of money. There's a little bit to go around for many parts of the state, including the Middle Cedar Puck 8 watershed, and that is through the Iowa watershed approach. So there'll be some opportunities for watersheds in that project as well. So the key messages that I want you to take away from this is that local leadership and engagement are really key in developing and implementing watershed plans. I can't emphasize that point enough. It's really important that farmers and landowners and local stakeholders are really involved in the planning process. Watershed planning is proactive. It's a good way to manage your resources, stay up front, and say this is our goal, our local goals. You can think about these broader community goals like the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, but these are our local goals, and this is how we want to achieve them. And through that, resources can be identified with the idea that it will improve opportunities to bring resources to the watershed. And then with this conservation targeting, that kind of conceptual plan map is a good way to efficiently spend those conservation funds throughout the watershed. So that's all I've got on watershed planning. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Could you comment on the effect of pattern tiling on this nutrient movement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was about the effect of pattern tiling on nutrient movement. Tile is a really great thing for agricultural productivity. It allows farmers to plant earlier. It moves excess water out of the fields, but it does create challenges for water quality. A lot of the times when we're talking about nitrates, those are moving primarily subsurface through drainage tile. So there's a couple ways we can manage that. We can think about limiting the amount of water that can flow freely into the tiles. And so one way to do that is to have continuous roots living in the soil through something like a cover crop, which can sequester some of those nitrates and keep them out of the tile water. And then edge of field practices like saturated buffers and bioreactors are great ways to treat pattern tiling, for example. Yeah.
With the goals and objectives, throw out to 2030.
Mhm.
I think it's useful to see, incremental improvements. You have those goals for practice goals. I didn't see any actually nutrient reduction goals, and that's what we're after. Practices are a means to get to those reductions. I didn't, you have baseline to 2030, but I didn't see any targets for in between. I don't know, maybe they're just not in that particular table, but are those in the watershed plans? 2020, 2025.
No, so we just did the modeling for 2010 baseline, 2015 conditions when the plan was developed, and 2030 after the watershed plan is implemented, if it goes according to plan. We didn't do those calculations, but they'd be relatively easy to run through our models.
Okay.
I think what he's trying to get at is, you're just taking numbers from the menu that Iowa State's put together, saying you do this practice, you're gonna get this out of it. I think what he's referencing is, what happens if we don't see that
Yeah.
in subsequent monitoring at the stream level or whatnot? We
Sure.
Go back to them and
You
adapt.
don't want to wait
and
to 20 to 30 to find that out.
Right, right.
That's why constant monitoring is important.
And you are doing monitoring on a routine basis.
Yeah, we are doing monitoring. I think that's a good idea, Nick, to see what those reductions would be expected to be. But Jeff makes up a good point. Yeah, so that table contains the expected nutrient reduction for both nitrogen and phosphorus practices, and that's what we've based our models off of. So it's based on the nutrient reduction strategy science assessment. Yeah, Al?
You can see that a big share of this cost is going to end up in the farmer, putting on cover crops. At the saturated buffer field, they've done an study for 6 years, and they do work. He mentioned that run off through tiles on a conventional field could run 15 to 20 easily. And where they have cover crops and no-till, they're running consistently in the 5 to 7. So these things work, and we need to help farmers get these started on their fields, because that's a big reduction right there.
I agree. Thanks. Yep. Up here first.
In a couple of the watershed maps, you had goals of the wetlands looked like they were in the upper reaches of the watershed.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my intuition was saying they should be more at the bottom to collect and treat. Why are they up in the upper reaches?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about why we've selected certain locations or identified certain locations within the watershed for wetland construction or installation. So we use the Iowa CREP program, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. That's kind of the guidelines for siting those wetlands, and the maximum recommended drainage area for those wetlands is about 2,000 acres. So if we keep them in the higher reaches of the watershed, they don't have to treat as much, and then the wetland size doesn't have to be as large.
Yeah, I think they are more effective than headwaters actually.
That too. There was a question back here somewhere.
Going back to that slide with the watershed.
Which one?
Like Miller Creek.
Miller Creek.
With the watershed.
Oops.
So the red dots there were the wetland.
Yep.
That I did.
Yep.
Surprised more.
Yeah. What incentive do I have to add an extra $10 to $15 per acre on my production on my farm to reduce the nutrients that go into the creek? Why should I do that?
Mhm.
How should I, and if I do believe in that, how do I convince my neighbor to do the same thing?
So you're getting at like the cost of implementing cover crops, something like that?
Yeah, if I don't put that extra $15, $20 in there, then it goes in my pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Why should I do that?
Well, so
Start by eliminating that assumption.
yeah, I was going to say complicated issue, right? If we're talking about cover crops, there are on-farm benefits to that, especially long-term sustained soil health and productivity. If you're talking about maybe like averaging out the cost of an edge of field practice over the cost of your field on a per acre basis, no on-farm benefit to you necessarily. It's part of participating in the community realizing that everything within the watershed is connected. And you can't make everyone believe that that's the right way to do it, but just through education and outreach, we can teach about the importance of those practices and that everything is connected, that what you do on your farm or on the edge of your farm fields does impact someone who turns on the water faucet in Cedar Rapids, for
If you're
example.
talking about cover crop and benefit to you in particular, numbers that we had from your sampling, Fred's sampling in field day, maybe he'll talk about that a little later, the Haney test, the dollar value that cover crop saved Fred was very high. Now, we're still in the process of trying to understand, are those real numbers, how much they adjust, but there's some real value to producers on the cover crop issue. Now, some of these other practices that you're talking about, maybe not so much, and that's where the state and federal government's going to need to step up to the plate and step up to the plate in a big way.
So can I just comment on that really quickly? So I think you bring up a great point that there is cost share available for these edge of field structural practices, but I think it's also important that farmers have some skin in the game, right? So it's not completely paid for the farmer.
Well, sure.
So farmers are footing some of the bill as well. So were you going to say something?
And I think nutrient management's probably low hanging fruit. You know, just reducing your inputs without reducing too much of your profits.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of confusion about nutrient management. There's definitely lots of opportunities to improve nutrient management for both downstream water quality benefits and also on-farm profitability, right? If you're over-applying and the crop's not going to respond, it might not be needed. But based on the science and the nutrient reduction strategy, we see a lot more reductions from things like cover crops and bioreactors and saturated buffers than we do from nutrient management. So it might seem like a low-hanging fruit, and I'm not completely disagreeing with you, but if we're talking about reducing nutrients, there's other options as well. I think we have time for one more question. Did you have a question, or are you the next speaker?
Can I introduce Senator?
There we go.
I'll introduce myself. Robin, do you have a quick one?
Yeah, as I understand it, the main crops that are grown in Iowa are corn and soybeans, leaving livestock out of the picture as a problem, and that the runoff of the excess nutrients is what creates the problem. So I wonder, are there crops other than corn and soybeans that could be grown on Iowa's land that would not create the negative effects that we have?
That's a big can of worms. I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible.
Did you look at it for these studies?
What's that?
Did you assess that as part of these studies?
Well, so one of the goals of the Miller Creek Watershed Plan, and it's actually a goal for all of these watershed plans, is to maintain that agricultural productivity. Right now, the markets are based on corn and soybean production. So we've tried to minimize the land that would be taken out of agricultural production in these watershed plans because there's the infrastructure and the demand for corn and soybeans. But if we think about things like perennial crops like miscanthus or prairie strips, something like that within a field that can be harvested, we think about targeting those to maybe poor performing locations or marginal locations within fields.
Well, let's give Karl a round of applause. So I